Okay, press will get started. Hi, my name is Marek Sullivan. I'm a PhD candidate here at Oxford. I've been given the enormous privilege to introduce a speaker whose breadth of interests almost matches the depth of her experience. And I'll try to convey some of that experience, but to be honest, it's going to be quite hard. So to begin, Anne Pellegrini is Professor of Social and Cultural Analysis and Professor of Performance Studies at New York University, as well as Director of the New York Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality. She holds undergraduate degrees in classics from Oxford and Harvard, an MA in the study of religion from Harvard, and a PhD in cultural studies, also from Harvard. She's a member of so many associations, it's hard to imagine these all apply to the same person, but they do. She's currently affiliated to the American Academy of Religion, the American Psychological Association, Division 39, the American Studies Association, the Modern Language Association, Performance Studies International, and the International Association for Relational Psychoanalysis and Psychotherapy. She's a Fellow of Psychology and the Other Institute, a contributing editor for Studies in Gender and Sexuality, and a candidate for the Institute for Contemporary Psychotherapy. Besides all these associations and commitments, she co-edits the book series Sexual Cultures for New York University Press, is general editor of States of Devotion, an interactive forum on religion and politics in the Americas, and a contributor to the Immanent Frame. I think it's fair to say that Anne keeps busy. She's won numerous prizes, so many in fact that I won't try to read them out here. You'll just have to visit her staff page for that. So as I mentioned, Anne has an extraordinarily broad range of interests. She works dexterously across disciplines combining politics, law, cultural studies, queer theory, philosophy, sociology, and psychoanalytical theory in fresh and innovative ways. She's published numerous books and maintains an active online presence through journals, blog sites, and forums. It would be impossible to summarize all of this here, so let me just outline what I take to be the key themes running through her work and zone in on a few items that seem especially relevant to this conference. At the most general level, Anne has an abiding interest in the power of affect and the effects of power. In her own words, she is interested in exploring how feelings are lived, experienced, and communicated between and across bodies, and the risks and possibilities these feelings pose for self and others. Her work proceeds from feminist and queer angles in order to interrogate normative schemas of embodiment and subjectivity, and, quote, to illuminate the cross-currents of gender, race, sexuality, and religion as they shape and impress the embodied life of feeling. Her first book, Performance Anxieties, Staging Psychoanalysis, Staging Race, published by Routledge in 1997, already addresses issues that have dominated intersectional, post-colonial, and queer critical thought since the early 2000s, namely issues stemming from tensions and interrelations between markers of gender, race, ethnicity, sexuality, and religion, and nationality. Anticipating affect-sensitive theorists of intersectionality like Sarah Ahmed and Jasper Poir, and drawing especially on Judith Butler, this book, and her later co-edited collection of essays, Queer Theory and the Jewish Question, published by Columbia University Press in 2003, both flesh out a psychoanalytical model that is attentive to, quote, the racialization of sexual difference and the sexualization of racial difference, and thereby uncovers and questions the simplistic binary reductions present even in supposedly critical works by showing how identity categories are always inter-implicating or inter-articulated. This interest in the interconnectedness of difference surfaces again in Love the Sin, Sexual Regulation and the Limits of Religious Tolerance, co-authored with Janet Jacobson and published by New York University Press in 2003. Here the authors turn to the close relation between American religious discourse in a country that claims to be secular and the regulation of threatening or deviant sexualities. They show that religious arguments and justifications pervade American public discourse, serving to police the boundaries between moral and immoral sexuality in a way that is anything but secular. Yet rather than defaulting to a hardline secularism that would purge public spaces of religion, they focused on the value of religious freedom, not tolerance, as a kind of conceptual key to undermine secular biases from within. The project is thus arguably not so much to destroy secular or democratic principles, but to carry them through to their logical conclusion, a conclusion which may not feel very good insofar as it challenges conceptions of national homogeneity by insisting on the non-negotiability of difference, but which is demanded by the principles we claim to live by. As she puts it elsewhere, democracy does not always feel good. A core theme of this conference and a dominant trend in secular studies for the last decade has been a problematization of secularism as a transnational, ahistorical concept. So it's becoming more conventional to speak of secularisms in the plural. Again, Anne was ahead of the game. She published the first major volume of essays dealing with precisely this issue 8 years ago. Secularisms, co-edited with Janet Jacobson, marks a major turning point in the development of secular studies by challenging an inherited Euro or US-centric Enlightenment narrative, equating secularism with modernity, reason, and progress, and making it the exclusive gift of a Western elite at the forefront of history. Between other things, the book furthers Talal Assad's project in Formations of the Secular to excavate the contingencies of secular history and thereby pull the concept down from the upper shelf of political ideals to the pluralistic mosaic of human bodies located in time and space. It should be clear that Anne has not so much contributed to a pre-existing field of secular studies as created it, along with other key writers like William Connolly, Saba Mahmoud, Charles Taylor, and Talal Assad. She has pushed us to rethink the boundaries between religious and secular, to engage with the complex interrelations between markers of identity, and to think affectively and pluralistically through the body as much as the mind. In her email correspondence leading up to this conference, Anne sometimes used her phone to send messages, or at least I think she did because I noticed she sometimes signed off with the bottom line, sent from my super ego. Don't worry, I've checked, I'm allowed to say this. Now my sense of humor is so impoverished that for half a day I thought this was actually the name of a new smartphone, and not, as I now interpret it, an incisive commentary on the moralistic authority and patriarchy of late capitalism. But aside from the deliberative performative contradiction involved in critiquing modernity through modernity's playthings, a contradiction that adds multiple layers of irony to an already ironic intervention, and also evinces a refreshingly straightforward concern for social welfare. Still pushing boundaries, her current work engages with psychoanalysis and the arts as practices that can help cultivate the capacity to bear difference, a capacity which I think we can all agree the world could use right now. So please join me in welcoming Anne Pellegrini to talk about Ghosts of Enchantment, Psychoanalysis, and Secular Time.
That was such a generous introduction. Thank you so much. I feel like I should just sit down and take questions, or or let Marek field them, even better. This has been an incredibly wonderful and luxurious, now 4 days. And also the structure of it. I mean, with lots of breaks and time for conversation amongst each other, it's been really wonderful. And I want to thank Donovan Schaefer, above all, for organizing this feast, and Veronica Martinez for getting so many of us here. It's been a really fantastic also to be back in Oxford with such beautiful weather. Okay. And let's just hope the media continue to charm. So I have 2 epigraphs. First from Walter Benjamin, dreaming has a share in history. And then from a New York-based psychoanalyst, Janine DePire, why not let the spirit of curiosity take us on a psychoanalytic caper? Part 1, a Coney Island caper. The fire started at Hellgate in the early morning hours of May 27, 1911. It was Memorial Day weekend in Coney Island, theme park to the world. Loosely based on Dante's Inferno, Hellgate took the intrepid on a boat ride through flame-lit whirlpools and underground caverns. But in the lead up to the summer season, hell had sprung a leak. Workers were now busy into the night, pouring bubble buckets of hot tar to repair the problem. There are reports of a light bulb exploding, igniting the combustible tar, or of a workman accidentally tipping over a bucket of tar which caught fire on exposed wires. What is clear is that shortly after 1:30 a.m., Hellgate was aflame. By dawn, all 22 acres of Dreamland had burned to the ground, from creation to the end of the world, from the midget city of Lilliputian to the beacon tower. Everything was ashes. Even the steel pier that allowed visitors to enter Dreamland from the waterside had melted into a pile of rubble. Soviet writer Maxim Gorky's much-quoted 1907 description of his own first view of Coney Island from the sea had proven to be eerily prescient. With the advent of night, a fantastic city of fire suddenly rises from the ocean into the sky. Dreamland was built to accommodate 250,000 visitors at a time, and at its peak, it hosted 1 million visitors a day. One of them was Sigmund Freud. Freud took a day trip to Coney Island, a magnified prater, as he called it, during his one and only visit to the United States in 1909. A lone account in a New York New Morning paper welcomed him with a common misspelling of his last name, announcing the US arrival of Professor Freund of Vienna. Freud had traveled in the company of Sandor Ferenczi and Carl Jung. With A.A. Brill and Ernest Jones as tour guides, Freud and Freunden spent a week exploring New York City before traveling to Clark University, where Freud received an honorary doctorate and presented the lectures that became 5 lectures on psychoanalysis. It is irresistible to imagine Freud, the man who called dreams the royal road to the unconscious, entering, floating into, wandering, walking into a materialized dreamland. This possibility of Freud at Dreamland is the jumping off point for multimedia artist Zoe Beloff's invented archive of the Coney Island Amateur Psychoanalytic Society and its circle, who were active from 1926 to 1972. The society was founded by Albert Grass, the Brooklyn-born son of Eastern European immigrants. Grass served in the Signal Corps in France during World War I. Now, in her own archival research on Grass, Beloff surmises that Grass likely encountered the work of Sigmund Freud during his period of wartime service in Europe. Perhaps, she writes, in one of the hospitals where his comrades were being treated for shell shock. She's not quite sure. And although Beloff does not propose this herself, and admittedly, I've not found any document to support my own hunch, it's certainly possible that Grass early on read Freud's monumental Thoughts for the Times of War and Death, either in the original German or in the first English translation by A.A. Brill under the title Reflections on War and Death. The translation was published in 1918, not long before Grass would have returned to Brooklyn after the armistice. And for those of you who would like to read along on your smartphone, it is actually downloadable for free by this company called Classics with an X, and it's a talking app. And it is, and I do not exaggerate or lie, or I engage in hyperbole often, but not at this very minute. The first app I downloaded onto my iPhone was this app.
Section 2. Our attitude towards death. It remains for us to consider the second factor of which...
It's really fantastic subway reading. Now, perhaps some of you are familiar with the 2 essays that make up this text, Reflections on War and Death. The first is The Disillusionment, or Disappointments, that's the translation preferred by Brill, The Disillusionment of the War. And the second is Our Attitude Towards Death. These are such forensic titles. Freud first delivered the second essay on death denial at an April 1915 meeting of the Vienna Lodge of B'nai B'rith, of which he was a member for much of his adult life, and where he often gave presentations for a non-academic audience, so he actually was speaking to the general public. Within weeks of its initial delivery in April of 1915, the lecture was published in German under the title Wir und der Tod, Us and Death. Not exactly the same as the title that's come down to us, Our Attitude Towards Death. Now, not only that, the original lecture's content also differed in important respects. Expunged from a subsequent German language version that appeared in Imago, the analytic journal that Freud founded, and from the multiple English translations of it is any specifically Jewish content. The most notable example of this deracination occurs in the first paragraph. In the version presented at B'nai B'rith and published in that organization's journal, Freud apologizes for the eerie title, Us and Death, but says it could have been worse. He quite nearly entitled it, these are Freud's words, We Jews and Death, for it is precisely we Jews who reveal most frequently and in the most extreme ways the attitude towards death that I wish to deal with before you today. Could the young Albert Grass possibly have read this first version, in which he was hailed as one of Freud's collective us? I don't know. The archive doesn't help us on this question, but we do know, or at least Beloff supposes, that Grass's wartime encounters with, in her words, 2 very different kinds of knowledge. On the one hand, the science of modern communications, Morse code, wireless telegraphy, and cinematography. On the other, the techniques of psychoanalysis. These made a startling impression on the young Grass. He set for himself the task of doing nothing less than to illuminate the workings of the unconscious through the medium of modern technology. The Coney Island Amateur Psychoanalytic Society, especially its annual Dream Films competition, grew out of this ambition. Now, dreams were always a prominent topic in the Society's monthly meetings, and Grass came up with the idea that members should make use of the relatively new medium of film to represent their dreams and picture the workings of the unconscious. None of them knew Freud's own antipathy towards film. Many members faithfully reenacted or otherwise converted their dreams into filmic impressions, submitting their finished products for the annual competition. Albert Grass himself submitted a film for the first competition, The Midget Crane. More on that film momentarily. Under Grass's visionary leadership, the Society developed a prospectus for a new Dreamland. Grass even drew up blueprints, eventually approaching Edward F. Tilliou, his one-time boss and the impresario behind Steeplechase Park, another Coney Island amusement park, to become the chief underwriter of a theme park that would elucidate both Freud's theory of dreams and the psychical apparatus. This is an amusement park made for me. Now, this is in the letter this is from the letter that Grass wrote to Tilliou, soliciting his both endorsement as well as his significant financial investment in this planned new dream world, Dreamland. He wrote, "Now for the first time, the masters of our nightly perambulations, the psychic censor, consciousness, the unconscious, the dream work, and the libido will be assembled into pavilions in a style both orderly and gay." I think that was the earlier use of the term gay, but I'm not sure. A train of thought, this was to be the theme park ride, a train of thought, linking each funhouse, fueled in its endeavor by an ample supply of ideas, will be set in motion. Tilliou declined, and in fact his refusal to participate in the project spurred a dream that Grass had, and this was then the focus of the dream he made into a film. Alas, as already mentioned, Tillieu did not bite. And so Albert Grass's fevered dream of a new dreamland erected on the ashes of the old didn't come to pass. Or did it? Using found objects, discarded home movies and archival photographs of the Coney Island world that Grass and his circle would have called home, as well as made ones, pastel blueprints conjured out of her own imaginative identification with this man who never was, Beloff fabricated a whole history of a people and a place, a dreamland that could have been. Albert Grass may never have existed, but he should have. He still might. Haunted by a past that never was, Beloff, or is it Grass? I waver in which name to call the author of this project. Beloff offers scenes of a future that might yet be. The not of Albert Grass, not quite real, not quite fictional, is also the uncanny procedure by which Beloff splices and reimagines the Heimlich in home movies. Put slightly differently, Beloff's found objects are not so much found as they are lost to be found again. A refinding, as Freud reminds us in his 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, that can never restore what actually was. This is not nostalgia. Beloff sees home movies the way Freud thought of dreams, jokes, and slips of the tongue, as entrance points into the unconscious wishes and fears. Home movies unspool the psychopathology of everyday life, or as Beloff colorfully puts it, they are, at their extreme, a living room theater of hell. This extremity is connected to, these are Beloff's words again, the repressed wishes and daily traumas that lie off frame but not entirely out of view. What are the wishes and traumas circled round by Grass's train of thought? For the fictionalized members of Grass's, Beloff's, Coney Island Amateur Psychoanalytic Society, they are both large in scale, the organized violence of war, and the everyday indignities of immigration, anti-Semitism, poverty, lost love objects. And not for nothing does the word amateur derive from the Latin verb to love. As we've seen, Albert Grass's film The Midget Crane from 1926 distills a dream of revenge against his boss, the one and only Tillieu, for an anti-Semitic insult. Molly Lipman's film, Chasing Louis Schneckowitz from 1945, shows us by now routinized footage of soldiers marching to a train station, arms raised in goodbye. They could be any soldiers going off to any war. Only the mode of transportation, a train, and the line of the uniforms helps locate them and us in historical time. And I would encourage you to take a look at the archives yourself. Zoe Beloff very kindly puts up a large number of these films from the Coney Island Amateur Psychoanalytic Society on her website at zoebeloff.com. So you can watch Molly Lipman's film as well as many others. In a fascinating 2010 interview with Beloff about her Coney Island installation, Niels von Thome aptly observes that the fictionalized biographies Beloff provides for the Society's members reveal them as, quote, outcasts, sexual, societal, or political, who found protection in the emancipatory realm of psychoanalysis. Conversely, many of the biographies can be read as a compendium of Jewish trauma as they relate to experiences of exile, anti-Semitism, and the Holocaust, close quote. This push-pull of sheltering protection and shattering trauma is the historical space reopened by Beloff and by the spirits she lets loose from a 20th century archive of feeling, to borrow Ancevekovich's term. It is also the carnival ride of the new, the modern, and the dream of progress as it whipsaws between sustaining life and delivering death. We can see this oscillation up front, at the Western Front, with Albert Grass and his fellow soldiers in the Signal Corps. The Signal Corps is responsible for developing, installing, and overseeing communications technologies for the US Armed Forces. During World War I, members of the Corps worked with the relatively new technology of radio in the form of radio phones, a kind of early mobile phone service. The Corps relied even more heavily on the telegraph and telephone for coordinating military actions. Soldiers like Albert Grass would have witnessed up close how new communication technologies initially designed and conceived as prosthetic enhancements for collapsing distance and making contact across space, they would have seen how these enhancements went beyond the pleasure principle to mete out unprecedented war and destruction. We are in the bombscape of the technological sublime, and we are back with Freud at Coney Island Dreamland. In his magisterial study of the American technological sublime, which this is a text that Courtney Bender was drawing on yesterday for her presentation as well, historian David Nye charts the way that great emotional experience of awe and wonder, often tinged with an element of terror, the way these experiences are mediated by encounters with, in his words, particular natural sights, architectural forms, and technological achievements. How did these new technologies of the early 20th century reshape not just the experience of time and space, but also the experience of experience? The electrification of the urban American landscape in the late 19th century and into the 20th century certainly inspired wonder and awe, as Gorky's gobsmacked description of seeing Coney Island at night attests. But electricity and the communication technologies it enabled also ushered in new forms of surveillance, social control, and even new forms of temporality. A stark example of this is the establishment of standardized time and time zones across the United States in the 1880s, a development driven by profound transformations in technologies for traversing distance, most notably the electric telegraph and the train. The telegraph and later the telephone booth both collapsed space, enabling instantaneous communication across large distances. The discordance between local times became jarring. Railroads needed to coordinate, that is, sync the timetable of trains with the local times they traversed. Before the American Railway Association effectively imposed standard time and regularized time zones, in November 1883, this is just one example, there was a plurality of local times across the United States, including 38 different standard times in the state of Wisconsin alone. But by October 1884, 85% of US towns with populations greater than 10,000 had switched to railway time. The new practice of keeping time became federal law when Congress passed the Standard Time Act in 1919. And there were similar moves to standardize were happening also in Britain and on the continent. The standardization of time increased the efficiency of train travel and its safety, although train wrecks still occurred with disturbing frequency, attracting the horrified fascination of the American public and also in Europe as well. As Mark Aldrich has documented, by 1907, train accidents had become the leading cause of violent death in the United States, and I think these numbers are also the same in the continent. Europe's railway record wasn't much better. Train derailments became a signature accident of their time. Train accidents offered the spectacular shock of the new, horrifying to those who witnessed them firsthand, but also fascinating to those who consumed stories of them in novels or newspapers or medical studies. Indeed, and beyond the pleasure principle, Freud names railway disasters as the leading example of the kind of, these are his words, severe mechanical concussions involving a risk to life that can lead to traumatic neurosis. It's actually, the references to trains in Freud's work and then later in Lacan and Fanon are so fascinating. I mean, there's a whole book or books to be written just about trains and psychoanalysis. Time standardization also ratified and in some sense helped to constitute the felt instantaneity of new communications technologies as they connected there to here. Of course, the establishment of uniform time, along with an array of electrical devices to tell the correct time, also enabled the extension of surveillance deeper into the body, with implications far beyond the industrial factory. In Nye's cogent phrasing, quote, once national time was in effect, being on time became an absolute rather than a relative standard, close quote. New technologies also gave rise to new structures of feeling, to use Raymond Williams' famous term. The telephone could magically connect us across space, but its prosthetic assistance was only necessary because, as Freud himself ventriloquized the mixed feelings of progress in civilization and its discontents, if there were no railway to make light of distances, my child would never have left home, and I should not need the telephone to hear his voice. So what enhancements the telephone provides are bittersweet indeed. These new regularities, modern technologized ways of being and moving and feeling through time and connecting across space, these were overlaid in other ways of telling and experiencing time. But what remained of these other ways of being in time? Can you be touched by two times at once? And if so, with what benefits and what losses? The 19th and early 20th century explosion of interest, both popular and scientific, in the US and Europe, in paranormal phenomena, owes not a little to the electrical reorganization of temporality. So did the conceptualization, and I'm going to suggest the very experience of trauma as a fracture in secular time. And I'm happy to take this up in the discussion afterwards. In a larger book project of which this talk is a part, I talk about this, I go into this more extensively, but I mean, one thing I just want to stress is that psychoanalysis is very much sort of a technology and a discourse of modernity. And it has a sort of a kind of double status with respect to trauma. It both gives us a way to account for it, to think about it, but it also can in some instances be being seen as having contributed to it. And this vivid description of the shell-shock divided subject of modernity caught between love and hate, in between two time zones, as it were, I think means that we have to caution. This isn't about sort of a heroization, nor is it about a kind of a villainization of psychoanalysis. The story is much more complicated. I think that psychoanalysis can offer vital possibilities of reparative response, and this, even as psychoanalysis itself, as theory and practice, has been a crucial interpolating mechanism, part of the very process of bringing life and the human, what it is to be human life, into the war machine of a specifically secular modernity. Again, I'm happy to talk about this at greater length in the discussion. Now, the regularization of time and its embodiment didn't go uncontested. As historian Carolyn Marvin argues, the new electrical media precipitated new kinds of social encounters that tested the bounds of previous ways of organizing social life, political power, and the meaning of the body. Coney Island exemplified these contrasting trends. Visitors stepped out of their everyday world, out of the disciplined time of labor, gendered propriety, class containment, racial segregation, into a topsy-turvy landscape charged to the last inch by electricity and libidinal currents, a term amusing with deliberation. Electrical contraptions offered thrill rides, accidents primed not to happen, though they sometimes still did. The first roller coaster was built and patented at Coney Island in 1884. It was a parody of the marvels and terrors of modern train travel. As architectural critic Rem Koolhaas notes, and he's making a reappearance in the wake of Courtney's citation of him yesterday, also from Delirious, New York, whole trainloads of people tear up and down its slope with such violence that they obtain the magical sensation of liftoff at the peaks. The wriggly tracks multiply on their shaky supports, within a few seasons turning the entire middle zone of Coney Island into a vibrating mountain range of steel. The thousands of people who flocked to Coney Island day and night, and the sheer number of lights arrayed along Surf Drive produced a perpetual daylight. They were more than passive consumers along for the ride. The carnivalesque immersions of Coney Island drew participants into the games and scenes organized for their pleasure. This pleasure prominently included the grotesque disorganization of the everyday. I'm thinking if Courtney gave us a sort of wonderful sort of view from above, we're actually here in the kind of seedy, wonderful, writhing underbelly from below. We'll go even further below with psychoanalysis. But this is a large part of what Coney Island was selling, a timed release from civilized social and sexual mores. Visitors could revel in the death and destruction brought to others as they watched recreations of variously the fall of Pompeii, the Johnstown flood of 1889, the San Francisco earthquake. Or they could gawk at sideshow freaks and primitives. And there's a whole other conversation to be had about the function of racial difference as part of the spectatorship and the production of an I who is not a you. In his own study of Coney Island, John Kassim reminds us that in Coney Island's funhouse mirrors, the spectator looks every bit the freak as well. So there's a kind of disturbance of some of the binaries being set up. This freakishness was part of the promise and the threat. Could the magical, monstrous transmutations, Kassim's term, the transmutations of experience last beyond the day trip? Well, let's ask Freud. Part 2. Electric imaginaries. Psychoanalysis straddled at least two ways of telling time. It also stood at the threshold between reasserting hegemonic forms of control and unleashing new kinds of social encounters and possibilities. There's a strong case to be made for the persistence of alternative temporalities, even within the most secular scenes of the modern. And psychoanalysis offers a rich case in point, with its codes of linearity and developmental imperatives, and its counter-codes. Past and present exist at the same time. In a sense, the unconscious doesn't even know how to tell time. Is the analytic process geared towards orienting the analysand to the right relation of time, what Elizabeth Freeman calls chrononormativity, a chrononormativity of before and after, then to now, a completed past? Or, and, might psychoanalysis be a way of acknowledging the haunting force of the past in the present, and making this co-presencing not just survivable, but a force for flourishing in the present and towards an unknown future? Is this psychoanalysis a secular seance? Perhaps. Certainly Freud's own descriptions of what transpires between couch and chair resonates with such occult phenomena as telepathy and spiritualism. Freud himself had a very complex relation to, I want to say, other spiritual practices. And I should also stop and say right now that I'm really talking here about psychoanalysis as a practice. There's a tendency in the humanities, in the United States Academy at least, where Freud lives to the extent that he lives at all, it's in the disciplines of the humanities. There's very little Freud is engaged in the social sciences. There might be a bare dip into Freud in psychology departments and often just to dismiss him. So Freud, has an ongoing life in comparative literature in English, for example, and in gender and sexuality studies. But he's engaged as a theorist, and he also often stands in for psychoanalysis tout court. That's just not the case. Psychoanalysis is multiple, and so was Freud. But psychoanalysis was first and foremost an embodying practice. So I'm really interested in thinking about it as a practice, including as a performance practice. And I'm far less interested right now in thinking about sort of it as theory. I think the theory came after, or importantly, comes after the practice and comes out of it. All right. Now, Freud himself had a complex relationship to other spiritual practices. He scandalized Ernest Jones and others among his followers by his belief in telepathy. He even published a number of essays in which he seeks to distinguish psychoanalysis from the wrong kind of dream interpretations, premonitory dreams, for example. But Freud was personally fascinated by telepathy, saw some connections between telepathy and the unconscious communications that took place between analyst and analysand, and engaged in experiments, probably attempts at thought transference, with Anna Freud and Sandor Ferenczi. Pushed by Jones to disavow telepathy, he was actually driving Jones and others to distraction on this question. He was pushed by Jones to disavow telepathy due to the way it was being used to smear psychoanalysis and its practitioners as occultists and quacks. Freud responded to Jones's request in a March 1926 letter thus: "If someone should reproach you with my fall into sin, you are free to reply that my adherence to telepathy is my private affair. Like my Jewishness, my passion for smoking, other things, and the theme of telepathy, inessential for psychoanalysis." I think it was a wish unfulfilled that his Jewishness would be his own private affair. The anxious question of how new media alter, transmute, and transmit what is imaginable and possible in the real are at the heart of psychoanalysis and its technology of talking and listening. In one of his early papers on technique, Recommendations to Physicians Practicing Psychoanalysis from 1912, Freud offers the would-be analyst instructions on how to hold in mind the vast amount of information conveyed by a single patient, let alone 6, 8, or even more, in the course of months and years of treatment, without, in Freud's words, confusing the details with similar material produced by other patients under treatment simultaneously or previously. And Freud was seeing patients 6 times a week, so our model of, 6 times a week, Lord. Right, 6 times a week. Sometimes there might be as short as a 3-month treatment. In other instances, they could go on for years. So the classical model of psychoanalysis isn't exactly the classical model that comes down to us today is the classical model of psychoanalysis. There was actually more heterodoxy in the kinds of arrangements being made. But Freud himself did not take notes. So what he's recommending here to physicians who would wish to become analysts is really about a kind of development of an attention that wouldn't require a jotting with a pen and paper during a session, a jotting that actually takes your attention away from what you're listening to and what's happening. So the solution to this problem, how to attend, and how to attend in such a way that you don't actually get lost in details or forget things, this is not easy. The solution to this problem turns on a specialized technique of listening, which Freud twice describes as simple, although in practice, including in Freud's practice, if his published case studies are to be entered as evidence, he does have an honest habit of publishing disasters, right? This technique seems anything but simple. It consists simply, his words, in not directing one's notice to anything in particular, and in maintaining the same evenly suspended attention in the face of all that one hears. This rule of giving equal notice to everything is the necessary counterpart to the demand made on the patient that he should communicate everything that occurs to him without criticism or selection. Freud continues, if the doctor behaves otherwise, he's throwing away most of the advantage which results from the patient's obeying the fundamental rule of psychoanalysis. The rule for the doctor may be expressed. He should withhold all conscious influences from his capacity to attend and give himself over completely to his unconscious memory. Or to put it purely in terms of technique, he should simply listen and not bother about whether he's keeping anything in mind. In a further, in the shuttle between the patient's free associations and the doctor's hovering ear, we're given a picture of two unconsciousnesses rising to meet the other without prejudgment of what is to be found. And it's this unconscious meeting between two unconsciousnesses that would later incline Freud to take telepathy more seriously. Now, in a further attempt to clarify the simple technique of evenly suspended attention, Freud directs the would-be analyst to turn himself into a telephone receiver. And I'll give you another block quote, and you'll see the male pronouns of Freud's text in it. And I'm preserving them for many reasons, both to I think it's actually important to sort of see the gender-specific pronouns being used. And here it's especially important, I think, because it also brings out a certain tension between the male pronoun and the feminizing receptivity that Freud is assigning to the doctor as he listens for, to, from the other scene. To put it in a formula, the doctor must turn his own unconscious like a receptive organ towards the transmitting unconscious of the patient. He must adjust himself to the patient as a telephone receiver is adjusted to the transmitting microphone. Just as the receiver conveys back into sound waves the electric oscillations in the telephone line, which are set up by sound waves, so the doctor's unconscious is able, from the derivatives of the unconscious which are communicated to him, to reconstruct that unconscious, which has determined the patient's free associations. Now, there's much to arrest in this passage. First, there's the striking modernism of Freud's reference to the telephone. And this is all the more surprising given Freud's well-established ambivalence towards modern technology. We do know that the Freud family early on had a telephone in their household, though Freud did not permit a telephone in his consulting or his waiting rooms. He had a strong antipathy towards film. He was ambivalent about the radio, shy about photography. There was shyness accentuated by living for 2 decades with jaw cancer, which caved in the right side of his face. So any of the photographs in the last 2 decades of his life, Freud would be photographed from the left deliberately so as not to show the concave right cheek. Now, second, and paradoxically, the sonic reverberations that Freud describes, along with the active passivity assigned to the receiver, here cast the presumptively male physician in an older role as a kind of spiritual medium communing with the dead. This is an apt double image for a practice that explores how the past continues to haunt the present and shape the future. The psychoanalyst as medium also amplifies the gender crossing, we could even call it a usurpation, performed in the exchange. For the great preponderance of spiritual mediums were women. As Anne Braudy has shown, spiritualism was even a major vehicle for late 19th and early 20th century US feminism. Now, this doubling, spiritual medium, telephone receiver, may also be one of those places where we can see psychoanalysis haunted by practices it left behind, namely mesmerism, magnetism, and hypnosis, and practices it actively disavowed, spiritualism. The telephone was born out of spiritualism. As Molly McGarry notes in her marvelous history of 19th century US spiritualism, Ghosts of Futures Past, Thomas Watson, the famed assistant to Alexander Graham Bell, experimented with the telephone as an aid to spiritual communication. McGarry also points out how new information and communications technologies of the 19th century, from the telegraph to the capturing of images and the photographic plate, to the telephone and then to the moving images of cinema, all provided a vocabulary and sensory horizon for imagining and enacting spiritualism's own communications across previously untraversable distances, namely between the living and the dead. Religious studies scholar Jeremy Stolo is similarly interested in how emergent technologies of mediated communication constituted a kind of electric imaginary for religious, technoscientific, and medical discourses of the 19th, and as Freud's reference to the telephone receiver suggests, early 20th century as well. Certainly throughout his work, Freud frequently analogizes psychic procedures to the workings of new electrical media, to the telegraph, telephone, photographic plate, cinematic projection. The language of electricity also charges his body of work with references to currents, drives, flows, etc. And I want to suggest that this is more than a shared set of metaphors. Here I want to think about the materiality of experience. An electrical imaginary winds right around Freud's couch, connecting speaker and hearer, and transmuting not just consciousness, but the unconscious itself. This is psychoanalysis itself, then, as one of the new electric media of communication, and erotic technology even, emergent in the fin de siècle. Part 3, time's up. Even before it became a body of theory identified with the proper name Freud, although he hardly exhausts psychoanalytic thinking or clinical practice, psychoanalysis was first and foremost an embodied and embodying practice that took place in a particular time and space between at least two subjects. And again, to go back to a point I made earlier, I think that too often the kind of academic uptake of psychoanalysis as theory overlooks or just plain looks past these lived practice-based dimensions of psychoanalysis. Now, to be sure, there are reasons to criticize with feminists what Freud and psychoanalysis have to say about gender and sex. There's also much cause to point out with Foucault, and sometimes feel like I'm sort of caught in that song, torn between two lovers. Foucault, Freud, right? I want them both. I'm greedy, right? There's much cause to point out with Foucault the ongoing ways in which psychoanalysis has historically participated in the incitement to speak of sex as our truth. Of course, even here, much depends on how we understand the psychoanalytic incitement to speech. If we think of the movement of speech and analysis as occurring, actually I should say, I'm going to back up from speech and saying the movement of communication, because it's really not reducible to language, to words. If we think of the movement of communication analysis as occurring between and across two spaces, then we might conceive this mediated and mediating communication not as a technology of self-revelation of the truth, but of becoming. Here I'm thinking also with Deleuze. From this perspective, psychoanalysis as practice potentially offers itself as a means of becoming or trying out becomings over time and in it. These becomings could take a whole range of forms that contradict the ostensible social truths and bounds of self and each other. At its best, psychoanalysis is less about finding and speaking the truth of sex than in opening up the order of desire to other scenes, other possibilities, other ways of living the self. I'd argue other ways of living the human as well. And I think there are some conversations happening, and I hope to see more happening about psychoanalysis and the post-human, or the non-human as well. If psychoanalysis really is, quote, what two people can say to each other if they agree not to have sex, I'm ripping that line from Adam Phillips, then it may well constitute a practice of freedom, a novel relational and aesthetic mode in the Foucauldian sense. And wouldn't that be deliciously ironic? For me, intellectual work is related to what you could call aestheticism, meaning transforming yourself, Foucault says in the 1983 interview, The Minimalist Self. Continuing, Foucault's words again, This transformation of oneself by one's knowledge is something rather close to the aesthetic experience. Now, alongside aesthetic experience, and perhaps even as a version of it, psychoanalysis offers itself as a possible site for queer experimentation. And I mean queer in a very broad sense. Part of this experimental force derived from the ways psychoanalysis as practice changes, or can change, what time feels like. Psychoanalysis depends on time, even as it suspends it. The clinical hour, repeated weekly, or even daily if the analyst is in classical psychoanalytic treatment, 3, 4, 5, 6 times a week, creates a set temporal and spatial frame precisely so that time, as it is usually experienced, can be relived, disrupted, retold. This disruption of time's everyday feeling may even have phenomenological overlaps with religious timeouts, such as the Jewish Sabbath. This suggestion would have scandalized Freud, the self-proclaimed godless Jew, who forbade his wife from lighting the Shabbat candles. But secularism, too, is not just a particular regime of knowledge, power, subjectivity. It is also a way of telling and living time. Living in time. Must we always live only on time? Psychoanalysis can disrupt those tellings. It can also reinforce them. With one foot in the Sabbath and the other in the standardized clock time of factory, office, and train travel, all those marvelous technologies of the new in Freud's own time, psychoanalysis, Freud's proclamations notwithstanding, is neither wholly secular nor wholly religious. And leave it to you to decide as you scribble notes whether it's wholly W-H-O-L-Y, L-L-Y, or H-O-L-Y, or maybe both. Why not? I'm arguing that psychoanalysis offers a kind of queer timeout, a space for transformation and experimentation. Now, I'm aware that this proposal runs up against Foucault's own strong criticisms of psychoanalysis in the History of Sexuality, Volume 1, and still more extensively in the History of Madness, a 1961 text better known to English language readers in abbreviated form and under the title Madness and Civilization. In her fascinating, brilliant, and polemical return to the full text of Madness, philosopher Lynn Huffer argues for the incompatibility of Freud and Foucault and of psychoanalysis and queer theory. Now, it's not always clear in Huffer's reading, and I think it's a really brilliant reading. I happen to disagree. But it's not always clear in her reading if the incompatibility is with psychoanalysis as theory or practice or both. But any which way, the psychoanalysis in question, which she's critiquing, seems more Freudian than Freud himself. It also seems frozen in time, with Freud as originator of a technique of patriarchal mastery, the doctor-patient couple, that amplifies the authority of reason over madness by drawing into itself and secularizing the ancient power of priests and magicians. Certainly, in its focus on the interior of a subject, of a family cell, psychoanalysis has expanded the reach of power into the body, and so often in the name of liberation. This is Foucault 101 from Volume 1 of History of Sexuality. Nonetheless, both Foucault's and Huffer's treatment of psychoanalysis seems to me partial, if not outdated. In Testo Junkie, a text that is also highly critical of psychoanalysis, Paul B. Preciado updates Foucault and Freud by showing how pharmacological resolutions have taken power even further into the body and situated it at the level of the molecule. At a time when weekly talk therapy, let alone analysis multiple times a week, is a luxury few can afford, insurance companies balk at subsidizing talk therapy for any extended period, unless it is cognitive behavioral therapy in emphasis. But pharmacological fixes they will ordinarily pay for. And I know there was a recent controversy in Britain about the kinds of mental health treatment NHS would cover as well, I think with a preference for CBT, a strong preference for CBT. In the wake of such transformations, there's something almost quaint and, dare I say, hopeful about inveighing against the talking cure as ruse of power. But is it possible to cite a term from a later set of investigations by Foucault, his 1977-78 Lectures on Security, Territory, Population? Is it possible that psychoanalytic practice today functions, or might function, as a kind of counter-conduct? By counter-conduct, Foucault means a form of resistance or struggle against the processes instituted for conducting others, against, he'll go on to say, pastoral power. In its modern forms, he argues, quote, the pastorate, the government of souls and their conduct, is deployed to a great extent through medical knowledge, institutions, and practices, close quote. It is precisely by virtue of its investiture with the powers once associated with the Christian pastorate that medicine also becomes a site of contestation and struggle, a whole series of revolts of conduct, as individuals and groups contest the terms in which they are being conducted, trained, disciplined through medical knowledge. Foucault's own examples of medical dissent, a word he almost used instead of counterconduct, include the organized refusal to submit to vaccines and the development of alternative medicine. In his most recent book, Adam Phillips has described psychoanalysis as one of the places in contemporary culture where we can reevaluate the history of our own obedience. At its best, psychoanalysis might constitute counterconduct against the forms of obedience in which we are trained to become and know ourselves as particular kinds of selves. Perhaps it could also become a kind of counterconduct against such dualisms as the religious and the secular. Who knows? Much of this potential, I'm arguing, derives from the slow time of psychoanalysis, the long patience of nothing happening, and the unsettling experience of talking and listening without having to know or ever being able to. This is psychoanalysis' will to unknow, undo, and be undone, practices of unknowing and undoing in which no one is or need be the master once and for all. It seems to me that so much of the project and the practice of lying on the couch is the invitation, discomforting, exciting, pleasurable, unnerving, sometimes boring, to unknow the self you thought you had to be. In this regard, at least, I hear and experience so much in psychoanalytic practice that rhymes with Foucault's challenge to loosen the holds of time. We are much more recent than we think. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. So we've got just under half an hour for questions. Donovan's going to go around with the mic. I guess if we try and do what we did yesterday and try and keep questions fairly short so everyone has a chance.
Sorry. First of all, thank you for that wonderful talk. My notes are like a roller coaster in Coney Island, I noticed. But yeah, exactly. All right, so here's my question. And I started off with thinking about a book that Stephen Connor wrote on the history of ventriloquism, in which he describes that ventriloquism, much like a number of the rites that you described in Coney Island, arise as a reaction to modern technology. Right, so people were fascinated with this synchronicity of this doll and the moving lips. And it seems to be really close, in any case in Stephen Connor's reading, that's a way to live through a certain trauma that he describes as synchronicity. And then in your second and in your third part, when you started talking about time, I started thinking more about this. And I was wondering specifically about two things. So Benedict Anderson describes secularity as empty homogeneous time, right, in which synchronicity seems to be some sort of regulatory and calm and stable principle. And I think you've focused on how psychoanalysis can offer a sort of queer timeout, as you've described it. At the same time, the synchronicity for Carl Jung, who also believed in certain paranormal modes of communication, he named that synchronicity, the capacity for things to resonate in meaning and even different minds to communicate with each other. Now, how does Freud's desire for telepathy, for instance, which can also be seen as a form of synchronicity, to the extent that it is a sort of direct communication overlapping in time, relate to the queer timeout that you've described? Because I can see it with Jungian fascination with synchronicity, but you seem to describe in your reading on psychoanalysis that the liberatory effect, as opposed to secularism, lies in the disruption of synchronicity. And as you notice, my question might be a little bit of a roller coaster, but I was wondering if you could improvise on this as well.
It's actually a fantastic set of thoughts and associations. Thanks. I mean, I think that, and this might go back to sort of one of the things I sort of left open. I do think that the category of trauma is, and I mean the category of trauma, is not thinkable outside the frame of secular time, as it's understood within the dominant secularization narrative of progress, of time's forward march. So within sort of the demand for sequencing from A to B to C, a sort of linear progression, following sort of a disruption of that creates the traumatic out of sequencing. So you have to get back in sync. So there's a certain demand for synchronicity, being in sync with time, not the same thing as instantaneity, or there's a certain demand for synchronicity that makes it possible to be traumatized, like to have, so does that make sense? So there's something, the conception of trauma is a sort of break in mind's capacity to narrate, bind an event. So this event that's happened, you can't quite pull into a kind of narrative track. So this, I mean, it's almost like, so the experience itself has been derailed. So that Freud's first example of sort of like the sort of traumatic event, the train derailment becomes sort of a model for the derailment of the subject in time. So there's sort of one, so I just think that outside of the demand for linearity, it wouldn't make sense to think trauma and conceptualize trauma as a fracture in time, because we could, think about the plural ways in which we inhabit time as potentially non-traumatic. But if we're supposed to embody time in certain ways, then certain events are going to sort of produce the trauma that gets produced by itself secularism. They're sort of mutually reinforcing. But this is not to romanticize trauma, because to say that I think the category of trauma is unthinkable outside secular time doesn't mean that prior to secular time or outside secular time people don't experience concussive events or experience events we might call traumatic. But they wouldn't be thought, I think, in relation to time in quite the same way. So that's the first move I would make, that, that synchronicity is both sort of something that's happening in the analytic experience. So the telepathy is a form of synchronicity, but what's being conjured is an experience out of the past. So you are potentially, that synchronicity involves two time zones at once. Or, three, depending upon how one thinks of it, but there is a gap in that communication. Because when Freud brings up the example of the telephone receiver, and he uses this language of sort of sound waves. So the sort of turning into sound waves, they go through they come out into the receiver, and then they get translated back into sound waves. So they're not the same sound waves that went in, right? So this is why I'm thinking, well, it's a synchronicity that always has a gap, right? So that there's always a time-space of difference, even in that moment in sync. I'm not sure if that answered the question.
Absolutely, it's fully in line with the reading of ventriloquism as well, right? We're always watching what the difference is.
Yes, and that's part of the pleasure of ventriloquism, right? You're like, oh, they're in sync, and then you look for the break, right? You kind of want both. I'm really interested in psychoanalysis I do think there's been, one of the really interesting things to back up is say that, there's this rich, still growing literature within queer theory in particular, but also feminist theories about temporality. And very little of it engages psychoanalysis. And psychoanalysis hasn't, for the most part, theorized time, even though the question of time is all over it, different psychoanalytic thinkers. So I'm just really interested in trying to think those two together, both at the level of theory, but also because, having been in the couch for a long time and now sitting in the chair, it is regulated by time. That's one of the most important frames for the experience. The beginning and ending of sessions are really crucial. And it's about this regulation in time. And then the question is, how could this regulation actually provide a frame that makes things that actually is not about containment, but about opening and loosening? So I'm really interested in the experience of time or times between persons. And also not just between persons, but thinking, I actually think, I'd love to hear from those of you in the room who are engaging in critical animal studies or some of the new materialisms, like how this could then open up encounters with non-human species in the non-human environment as well.
Thanks. Thank you for your brilliant talk. I have in mind Ricoeur's essay on Freud and philosophy, and how at the beginning he makes this distinction, right, between the hermeneutics of recollection and then the hermeneutics of suspicion, which is where he locates Freud. And his argument is that listening is essentially the opposite of what suspicion is, right? That you can't, they're at odds with each other. And he thinks of Iliade and Otto, like the phenomenology of religion, as an openness and listening to what could be coming from a transcendent source, whereas suspicion, you kind of already are prejudiced, and sure, you're listening to the patient, but you already sort of know that that there are certain things that are off bounds that you won't even consider. So I just wanted to see if you can comment on that and whether you consider Freud a so-called master of suspicion, and if so, do you think that suspicion is compatible with listening?
It's a great question. I mean, one of the delightful things about reading Freud, and I've been reading Freud now for a long time, or I should say rereading Freud for a long time, is that there are so many Freuds within Freud. So you get to see Freud contradicting himself. I mean, in my own experience also, since they're coming back to essays it over and over again and having a different sense of what Freud might be arguing, but he is also arguing with himself, sometimes knowingly, sometimes unknowingly. I mean, there is a Freud of the hermeneutics of suspicion, absolutely, sort of who seems to know better than the patient what the patient means. But we also, Freud's papers on technique, and he didn't write that many papers on technique. So the 1912 paper stands out. I mean, it's in that sense anomalous in his large body of writings. But in his papers on technique, you get him describing something that is a much more open, much more porous process than his case studies would seem to suggest. So I think there's a lot more happening in the room with Freud, let alone with the hundreds and thousands of psychoanalysts and psychotherapists that have followed Freud and used different techniques or think with different sort of, let's say, opening, sort of premises than Freud. What was actually happening in the room between Freud and his patient is not necessarily captured by the few case studies he gives us. So I think, the Freud that I find useful certainly as a clinician, but also the Freud that I find useful as someone who's sort of thinking with psychoanalysis as a way to think about, where are the places where we can cultivate the capacity to live with difference and the discomfort of difference, including the discomfort of our own difference from ourselves, the ways in which our past and present don't neatly align, and Lord knows what the future is going to bring. And I think that psychoanalysis as a practice is one of those spaces, but I also think that different versions of psychoanalytic theory also tell us about how to live with the tension, our desire to commit acts of violence, let alone against enemies, so-called enemies and strangers, but against our nearest and dearest. And in the Freud essays that Freud wrote, especially from 1914 onwards, deeply inflected by the experience of World War I, where 3 of his sons fought for Austro-Germany. I think he's really talking about what does it mean to sort of live with, our desire to sort of, we actually hate the people we love. And the denial of that ambivalence, what does it lead to? It leads to our acting out that destructiveness against others, because we actually can't bear, we feel so guilty about that mixed set of feelings towards our own. So I think that, that part of this dimension of what does it mean to be open, including open to the worst parts of ourselves? Part of that comes out of a practice of listening where you actually don't know what's going to happen. And at least in the 1912 essay, he's giving us a picture of the analyst is in fact not the master of the room. The analyst is sitting there listening and free associating alongside the patient. And there's a kind of an interesting momentary equivalence that Freud is offering. One line connecting the other. They're both hovering in the air above couch and chair. And yes, Freud hasn't yet started thinking about what does it mean that I'm making an unconscious contribution to this too. So the master comes back into the room. I shall interpret the unconscious communications of the other. But I'm doing so through this kind of unconscious meeting. Other analysts and other people will sort of talk about what does it mean to think about one's own unconscious presence there. But there is a very porous, deep practice of listening there present that I think he's encouraging. And it's one that means that both the analyst and the analyst have to hold tight to the furniture. there's a moment in an essay roughly contemporaneous to the 1912 paper on technique. It's his essay on transference love from, I think, 1914, which he uses this amazing theatrical metaphor. He's sort of talking about the eruption of a transference, so the intense feeling the patient develops for the therapist. And Freud says it's as if you're, basically someone were in a theater to stand up and yell fire in a crowded theater. And it breaks the fourth wall. What are you going to do? And Freud says, in this instance, stay seated. Don't rush from the theater. And I think this is a model for what does it mean to stay present to feelings of discomfort, to not believe the fire has to be real. Act as if it might be, to work with it, but not act as if it is, such that you might violently run from the room, trample over others to do so. So I think there's a Freud, the shorter version to your actually really helpful question. There's a Freud who is about openness, not suspicion, right? And that's the Freud I find really useful and really important for thinking about social conflict, and also for thinking about, at the macro level, for also thinking about the micro level, where we can sort of practice living that discomfort differently.
Thank you very much for your talk. Thank you. Thank you very much for your talk. I was wondering, this image of Freud as like a patriarch or like a father of a whole psychoanalytic movement. And I recently was reading some of Jacques Derrida's work, and he was just quoting a letter from Sandor Ferenczi to Freud, talking about Jung, but he was telling him like, you, Mr. Freud, our father, you are the only one who is available to psychoanalyze yourself, but we mortals, like, it is very funny, but we don't have this capability, or we are not able to psychoanalyze ourselves. So that put Freud in a God position, that he was the only one who could judge not only the one that was in therapy, but also himself. So I was wondering if I come from Argentina, so psychoanalysis is
right,
very
yes.
strong there,
Yeah.
and sometimes it's very sectarist and almost a religion itself. So I was wondering if you could, I don't know, tell me something about how do you see that specter of Freud, in the psychoanalytical movement?
That's a really great and also fun question, but I should also say, since you mentioned you're from Argentina, one of the things that's so interesting is that, there are so many vibrant versions of psychoanalysis in theory and practice happening today. Argentina has one of the most lively scenes. Also, there's an amazing scene happening in Italy, London, New York. And also there are different psychoanalyses that are going on. Actually, maybe I want to say psychoanalysis and do like a Greek plural, but so it is. Psychoanalysis is not one today, and it's also really interesting to think about different national inflections and to it. I think Freud. There's a way in which Freud is this is not just there is a way in which it is actually true that Freud is the only psychoanalyst who never underwent psychoanalysis. One of the requirements of becoming a psychoanalyst is that you be analyzed for a set period of time. And there's a huge controversies about sort of the institutionalization of psychoanalysis, what different institutes demand, but one constant is that you yourself have to undergo one. Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, helped to formulate that requirement, but himself, as the founder, never underwent it. But he gave us, this long 2-volume study, Interpretation of Dreams, in which he basically is giving us an accounting of his own self-analysis. His own dream analysis, which became sort of the launching pad for psychoanalysis. But there's a way in which he's an exceptional figure from the start, and not simply because he's sort of the author function of Freud for psychoanalysis, but he's exempt from what becomes one of the fundamental rule of training to become this thing. And he certainly, has a long history of failed romances. From Wilhelm Fliess, Jung is also a famous such example. Just Freud, famously had cultivated strong male friendships and also strong sort of acolytes, men, and then had famous breakups with them, in which he couldn't tolerate their apostasy. And so, I mean, he didn't have the same kinds of breakups with many of the female analysts in his circle, which is also interesting, perhaps because he didn't have the same intensity of friendship, but he did encourage female analysts. Joan Riviere, quite famously, among others. But there's something about, the father function of Freud then, in some sense gets, is it unconsciously projected into the body of theory with Oedipus? Is it there in group psychology and the analysis of the ego? Freud, not a humble man, but also at the same time, I think, gives us the humility of this, again, he publishes case studies that were kind of disastrous. So there's a really, he's a really complicated figure around that, his own height and fall.
Mary Jane, did you have a question?
Yeah, sure. It was in relation to the question before, actually, and I had been hoping to hear more about the term unknowing, which you used at the very end, just where we go with that, because it seemed to me that unknowing could be a really nice little link between, say, suspicion and openness, right? That suspicion doesn't have to be, I know better than you. It can just be like, let's stay, let's sort of refrain from judging the situation and see what comes out of it. And then in that case, the two aren't really as distinct from one another, suspicion and openness, as they might be. But also, I grabbed onto that word because I'd been wondering, like, where your psychoanalysis goes. Like, where does it go? Is the purpose of trying to inhabit or retell or tell or come to or surface trauma for the sake of getting back on the track and getting somewhere, or in which case this sort of temporal interruption services like capitalist time, or is it going somewhere else, or does it not know where it's going? So anyway, if you could hover over unknowing a little bit, I would love that.
Okay, that's great. Maybe since there's two-part, to go to the second part first. I don't think, one, this is the kind of subversive, kind of hegemonic sort of move. There's a way in which, if the repair of trauma is getting you back in time, so you can tell the story of what happened to you. Again, and I want to be very careful, I in no way wish to be romanticizing the experience of violent rupture, of the experience of violence. But if the ability, sort of getting back in sync with time, is this then a rehabilitation towards, sort of normalization, or, sort of being on track? Or might there be, I'm more and more thinking that the language of binding trauma, giving it to meaning, isn't adequate if we think that this is about mastering trauma. I'm really inspired by a forthcoming book by Julietta Singh on thinking mastery, and sort of thinking about how do we let go of mastery as a goal, whether in the classroom or elsewhere, the analytic space certainly, but what if it's about not mastering trauma, but coming to terms with living alongside the places in which we're wounded, the places in which we're broken, the shared histories of violence, a history that I might share with another in the same time, like a sort of relation of horizontal time, or I might share with others in times and well before my own or in the future. So I think there's a way in which thinking about trauma as a break in time might be, do we have to recuperate so that it now seems seamless? Or can we actually live with that looseness and let the multiple time zones sort of really cohabitate? So that's the first thought. And that's sort of, and again, I want to be really careful about not romanticizing this, because also, we can have theories, right, about great theories, but then in practice, what does it feel like, right? To feel as if you can't actually tell your own history or come to a particular relation with it. And then one further thought about this, to say that one is dislocated from one's own experience, such that you can't bring it into a narrative or give it to meaning, is not the same thing as saying it doesn't belong to history. It might be that you can't sort of tell it within the fold of your own history, but trauma is always historically located, even when it happens to a particular individual. All right, this is the second part of the question, but the first one, unknowing, I think it's, one of the things that I'm noticing as I'm inhabiting two spaces, the classroom and the analytic space, as a therapist and not simply as a long-time couch dweller, is that the strategies that you're trained to use in the classroom, you just can't use in the analytic space as the therapist or analyst, use whatever term you like. So that, one of the things, we come in as teachers to the classroom, and we have a set of texts, maybe we've assigned, or materials we're using, and we have a story we want to tell, and we have places we hope our students will go, and we're tracking conversations, with many students in the room. We're trying to sort of tie things together in a neat bow, but then we're thinking, well, really, we need to get to this point. And we get derailed, but we come back, right? Well, we are kind of knowing subject, even as I hope, as teachers, we're also open to the surprises that can happen. But we do have a track, right? And we are in control of the conversation. Well, we don't unknow in the same way, right? Whereas, in the analytic space, this is why I think thinking about psychoanalysis as practice is so important for them practicing that openness outside of this room for 45 minutes, however many times a week. That's how long the hour is in New York, 45 minutes. This is why I talk so quickly. You have to talk fast or listen quickly. So the unknowing is, I don't know where this is going. If I presume to know where this is going, then I have stopped listening. And those moments when you ask a question, and one asks questions sparingly, because a question can derail, you just want to let things happen. The question has to be, and this is not by any means an argument original to me, the question has to be the patient's, not yours. So you only ask a question to which you genuinely are wondering about the answer. Not because, to go back to the idea of the hermeneutics of suspicion, you think you know the answer, and you're asking it, sort of like my imaginary beard, you're asking it because you want to see if the patient's there. No, you're asking because you're like, maybe you need some factual information, but the other kind of question, like, I'm wondering if, it really is like, I don't know. And you can unknow together. And including unknowing together, or maybe providing a facilitating space in which the person telling his, her, their story can unknow and rewind the way that they thought they had to be put together. Right? So that it's this unknowing of what they thought they already knew about themselves. So that's the Foucauldian psychoanalysis to me.
One of the early quotes that you have printed up there where Freud is responding to Jones's concerns about his love of telepathy. Yeah. There's a series of things, and I think I was pipe smoking, telepathy,
cigar smoking, yeah.
My Jewishness, and other pleasures, right? And I thought that was an interesting group of things. I think you briefly said something like, I wish he didn't have to feel that way about his Jewishness, right? Like he was kind of like saying, this kind of thing I want to put over here, but yet the things he was putting over there were things he loved or desired, right? That gave him pleasure. And I just thought you might want to talk a little bit more about that fact that collection.
I mean, it is a fascinating collection, and I'm trying to find the exact quote, because they, what do they have in common? I mean, certainly, there's a profound wishfulness to the idea that his Jewishness could ever have been his own private affair. 4 of his sisters died in camps. He's constantly trying to sort of sever a relation between psychoanalysis and associations with Jewishness. I mean, it actually informs, I think, some of the moves he makes in thinking about sexual difference. So he has, he puts together his Jewishness, his passion for smoking, and other things. So his passion for other things, what are the other things? And the theme of telepathy. they're his private affair, inessential for psychoanalysis. I mean, it's very interesting at this moment, since he's writing in 1926. He's already had many surgeries for his jaw cancer, which certainly was likely caused by years of cigar smoking, and this was something Freud could not give that up. And so there's something very interesting about my passion for smoking, listed alongside his Jewishness and telepathy, all of these. So it's the smoking, in some sense, was killing him. All right, and the Jewishness is, and both Jewishness and telepathy are two things he needs to he needed sort of push off as being too close to psychoanalysis because it would discredit. So there is, I mean, it's interesting, 1926, I mean, there is something really interesting about, he's listing all these things that one could see as, are they tainted with the death drive? I mean, what are the, what is his, it's as if he wants to set them aside, and yet he's knowing and unknowing at that moment about these vital elements. Right? But I hadn't thought until this moment about how my passion for smoking is. He's actually saying that I know my love for things that are killing me.
I think we're about coming to the end of our time. Sorry. So if we could just say